Welcome back to the Transatlantic Debrief. Yes, no longer the neo-medieval ledger. We have undergone a name change, long in advice by many of you listening, and we came around. Thank you for the advice along the way. Today's conversation comes at a pivotal moment for Europe and the transatlantic relationship, with Washington applying maximum pressure while offering minimal commitment. European leaders are being forced to confront fundamental questions about the continent's future, questions about strategic autonomy, defense integration, and whether the EU can act decisively in a world that won't wait for consensus among the 27 member states. To help make sense of this moment, I'm joined by Erik Jones, director of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, and one of the leading voices on European political economy and transatlantic relations. With that, here's my conversation with Erik Jones. Erik Jones, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
So when we last spoke, you expressed a cautious optimism about the transatlantic relationship's resilience, a perspective that's informed by decades of research. I think we could all use a little bit of that optimism right now. So, what are the historic moments or patterns that gives you confidence that we can navigate this crisis that we're experiencing right now? And how has the relationship's evolution positioned us for this moment?
Okay, so let's put the emphasis on cautious and not on optimism. I'm cautious because clearly there's been a major rupture in the transatlantic relationship. And this has been building for a long time. So for structural reasons, the United States and Europe have been moving apart. And then this big push by the Trump administration to antagonize the Europeans. And let's face it, their goal has been to antagonize the Europeans. This big push by the Trump administration has only made matters worse. That's the caution. The optimism comes from the fact that if you were to look at any two parts of the world, it would be hard to find two parts of the world that have a closer set of values than Europe and the United States. And that applies on both sides of the political spectrum, right? It's not as though all Europeans are good and only some Americans are good. There are Europeans who think a lot like people in the United States who don't like the transatlantic partnership the current way it's structured. And there are many Europeans, just like there are people in the United States, who do. And that gives us the ability to communicate much more freely than we would have otherwise. And we're going through very similar political dynamics. And those political dynamics don't have to be exactly the same for us to appreciate the possibility for dialogue to emerge out of them. So the optimism is that, however much antagonism we see at the top political level, there are these ties that bind further down. And those ties that bind are underpinned by trillions with a T, trillions of dollars or euros in investments by Europeans in the United States and Americans in Europe. So when you put all those things together, I don't think that the United States and Europe are ever going to go to war, but I do believe that they're having a hard time right now, and I'm hopeful that there'll be some opportunity for that to get better.
So I want to focus a little bit on the antagonism part that you talked about there. So, we have this Trump administration that's applying maximum coercion and is really offering little commitment, in reciprocation of this. How should the EU be engaging an administration that does undergo its diplomacy and its policy like this? I mean, today we have EP negotiators, or the lead EP negotiators on the EU-US trade deal, that are discussing probably right now or sometime soon about how they want to approach this and move forward the deal. And what would your advice be to them of how to posture with this administration?
Look, so much of this really hangs on the psychology of negotiation, right? And the particular psychological characteristics of the Trump administration. The European Union clearly has instruments that it can use to escalate this very tense situation. And the question is, if they escalate, is that going to get the United States to back down, or is that going to get the United States to escalate even further? I think if the Europeans had come out straight out of the gate and escalated, the Trump administration probably would have backed down or come to some kind of compromise. We wouldn't have gotten rid of the new tariffs entirely, but we would have a different kind of conversation about where trade policy is going on both sides of the Atlantic. The Trump administration clearly believes that it can threaten and cajole the Europeans, and that the Europeans ultimately will not push back. And the more the Trump administration is convinced of that, the harder it becomes to escalate without facing further escalation. So the question is are the Europeans going to run out the clock on this? And by running out the clock, I mean, wait till the midterms, create an opposition in Congress that changes the dynamic around administration trade authority, or wait until the next round of presidential elections bring somebody else into office. I'm not sure that's a wise strategy, but that seems to be what they're doing,
Mm,
right? The other strategy would be to say, okay, well, we missed it out the gate. We probably should have been firmer in pushing back against the Trump administration. Now we're going to have to go through 2 or 3 cycles of escalation in order to reestablish some kind of parity. But in the end, it'll be worth it because the deal that we'll get will be better, right?
yeah.
I I'm not a professional trade negotiator, and so I wouldn't say I have a strong preference for one strategy or the other, but I think those are the only 2 strategies they have available.
Yeah. So, part of why the EU is so exposed is it has built this kind of dependent relationship and most, of course, on defense and security. And you've been a proponent of the EU's need to achieve strategic autonomy. And, right now that phrase is being accepted and used by a lot of folks across Europe, but it kind of holds different meanings by each individual who uses it. So I want to ask you, what does strategic autonomy mean to you? How do you define it? And do you think that you can achieve that definition through the incremental nature in which it, goes about achieving this kind of robust reform?
Okay, so strategic autonomy is one of those great jargon words that sounds super important until you figure out what it's really saying, right? So, do I believe that the European Union should be able to act purposefully, right? And I think, yes, the European Union should be able to act purposefully, but that's what strategic autonomy means, right? The strategic bit is the purpose, and the ability to act is the autonomy. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, in what ways do we want the European Union to act? When the concept of strategic autonomy was introduced originally in around 2013, the introduction was we need to achieve strategic autonomy through better coordination in our defense industrial policy.
Hmm.
Why? Because the Obama administration was already putting pressure on the Europeans to increase their defense expenditure because the Europeans themselves saw that they could not act in Libya without the support of the United States, and they could not act in Syria if the United States wasn't going to go there either. So strategic autonomy was narrowly defined in terms of defense industrial production that could lead to the ability for the Europeans to deploy military force with purpose, right? Over time, strategic autonomy has expanded to include all kinds of things. It expanded to include the ability to push back against the weaponization of interdependence in 2016, not 2016, right, which is before Trump gets elected. In 2016, because the United States was using all kinds of access that it had to market infrastructures in order to put pressure on the Europeans that the Europeans really didn't appreciate. Then they expanded it further to think in terms of trade policy, and then they expanded it further to think in terms of supply chain management. And that was in
Hmm.
the context of the COVID pandemic, right? And suddenly you've got this whole nest of things that are coming together. And increasingly, as strategic autonomy expanded to everything, it begins to drop out of the conversation in a weird way. Because why would you talk about strategic autonomy when what you're really talking about are discrete instruments that you're going to be able to use by Europeans or going to be able to have Europe use in a purposive way? So if you were to look at the anti-coercion instrument, which is
Hmm.
their big, powerful instrument for pushing back against economic coercion, there is no mention of strategic autonomy at all in the legislation that describes that instrument. If you were to look at the European Defense Industrial Program that was recently passed in December, there's no language of strategic autonomy at all, except for one small reference that basically says, this is the standard that we need to achieve in our defense industrial cooperation. So now everybody believes that the European Union should be able to act with purpose. And the focus is what are the instruments they're going to use to achieve that goal, right? So strategic autonomy in an odd way drops out of the conversation because everybody takes it for granted.
And so the ability to act, I think we're seeing also just the perspective of that ability to act, you have the tools, but then how to get actually the EU to have a global role, different takes on this. And that really is the issue at a governance level. And so, last week we saw German finance minister who sent a letter to 5 other European countries calling for them to basically create a 2-tier Europe. We'd have a core group that drive the capital markets union, defense cooperation, and then, this would then benefit and trickle out to other members of the European Union. Of course, this faced immediate pushback, as this always does. So my question to you is, in the ability for the EU to act, can the 27 take on this global role to really have the EU be a viable competitor, alternative to the US, to China? Or will there have to be some type of tiered layer that, has these tools on the table, but they're used maybe by a certain coalition of the willing?
Europe has always been many things at the same time, right? And we talk about the European Union and we're focused on the European Union because it has a certain set of institutions that give it a center of gravity. In those institutions and the people who lead those institutions, and here I'm thinking about Ursula von der Leyen in particular as president of the European Commission, become focal points for our attention. But let's face reality, right? You can't really talk about Europe without the United Kingdom. You can't really talk about Europe without Norway. You can't really talk about Europe without Switzerland. That doesn't mean the United Kingdom, Norway, and Switzerland have to be part of every decision.
Mm,
What it does mean is that Europe, in one or many of its manifestations, is going to include those countries and exclude those countries, depending on the issue at play. And so when you talk about the 27, I don't know if the 27 is a magic number that is going to constitute Europe in its purposive behavior, but I expect to see Europeans behave purposefully. And so if the German finance minister is saying, okay, let's get a small group of Europeans together, European countries together to behave purposefully, well, that's not a dumb idea in the sense that each of those individual countries has the ability to do that. It has strategic autonomy, the capacity to behave purposefully. And you bring them together and they can do that collectively. And it wouldn't be the first time we've seen that. The European monetary system was created that way, not through European institutions. The Schengen area was created that way, not through European institutions. The European Union itself was created that way, right? And so when you think about that purposive behavior, what you have to accept is that some countries are going to move before other countries, but eventually everybody is going to be implicated, even if they're not formally part of the mix. And what you see with Switzerland, for example, is that Switzerland is not formally part of the mix, but Switzerland is certainly engaged in Schengen, and Switzerland is certainly engaged in other areas of cooperation that it just can't avoid being engaged with. And I would expect to see that across Europe looking ahead.
So one of the main tools that EU does have to act abroad is enlargement. And you've researched this thoroughly. You've talked about how enlargement actually can be a security endeavor. Right now we're seeing enlargement as an initiative accelerated, but then we're seeing it really kind of inhibited from making it across the finish line maybe. So do you think that the EU is capable of enlarging at this moment, or will we see kind of this tiered relationship developing internally within the EU, as you're talking about, various kind of circles within circles starting to form, and then unilateral relationships and partnerships kind of forming outside of the EU's borders?
So when we talk about enlargement, there's the formalistic idea of enlargement, which is that the different countries become formally member states in the European Union. And then there's the kind of sphere of influence, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
notion of enlargement, where different countries get drawn into the orbit of the European Union and affected in very powerful ways by what goes on in the European Union and begin to exercise influence over what goes on in the European Union, even if they're not formally member states. I don't think that process is stopping, right? What's happening is the formalistic part of enlargement is being slowed down because, like any political procedure, there are ways to game the system to jam up the works and make sure that everybody stays on the same page until this formalistic thing comes to an end. But let's not kid ourselves. The European Union cannot escape the consequences of this horrific violence that's going on in Ukraine.
Mm.
And so Ukraine is, for want of a better term, part of the European sphere of influence. There are millions of Ukrainians living in the European Union. The economy of Ukraine is now dependent on European support. And you can't just let Ukraine collapse and not expect dramatic consequences for the European Union. So we don't have to call it enlargement if we don't want to refer to this formalistic thing.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, European Union has much more interest in Ukraine now than it did in 2003, right? During the Orange Revolution. And many are looking back at 2003 and wondering, well, maybe the European Union should have paid more attention to Ukraine then, and we could have avoided a lot of the heartache for Ukrainians principally, but also for everybody else that intervened in the 2 decades plus some that have happened since. It's not just Ukraine, it's also the Western Balkans. The European Union has been ignoring the Western Balkans the best it can, with the partial exception of Croatia, for the better part of 2 decades, and now they realize that was a mistake, right? And they may enlarge to the Western Balkans. I hope they will enlarge to the Western Balkans, but they can do that in one of two ways, right? They can do it slowly and painfully and force the Western Balkans to adhere to the European Union according to the standard terms of membership that exist today, or they can just change what membership means and bring the
Yeah.
Western Balkan countries in and stabilize them and make them more prosperous and benefit from that interaction in a different way, right? I think just because we're looking at institutions now does not mean we should assume that those institutions will be forever unchanged,
Mm.
right? And what membership means today may not be what membership means when these countries come in, even if that's a very short period of time. Redefining membership is something that we could do relatively quickly.
And this redefining membership, I think it was last week that Belgian Prime Minister De Wever, in a speech, basically talked about how, right now the EU, by nature of not wanting to talk about how these institutions and systems can change, is kind of just posturing, making these promises they can't keep. And he was talking about how everyone says Ukraine's going to be a member in the next few years. No one actually believes it, but if you ask them, publicly, they'll say that's going to be the case. And then he went on to basically say that the EU needs to be thinking about itself as like the Roman Empire, where you had, and he had more specific terms than I recall exactly, but basically you had the core, and then you had like an association, and then once they upgraded from an association, they were more like direct political cooperation, and then there was like the third layer of when they're actually part of the Roman Empire. So do you see his vision kind of being the way the institutions can shift and bend to accept folks? Because he also described as well that if they don't, what's to stop these countries from going to go and find new partners and allies, be it China or the new U.S. or whatever that develops into?
So Bart de Wever studied history as an undergrad, so I wouldn't argue with his historical parallels. What I would suggest is that look at the expansion of the European Union to Bulgaria and Romania, right? They changed what it meant to be a member state by putting them under specific forms of conditionality, right? And giving them a prolonged adaptation process, particularly in terms of rule of law and corruption. And those countries are still, to a large extent, excluded from Schengen, right? Not completely excluded from Schengen, but largely excluded from Schengen. And so, their status as member states is different from the status of a country like Germany, right? I think we will see that kind of flexibility in the next iteration of enlargement. And we're already starting to see the playing around, right? Let's get these new candidate countries to promise that they won't exercise a veto in the procedures for decision making for X amount of time or until they achieve X qualification. That is a redefinition of what membership is. Let's not kid ourselves. They're changing the rights and privileges of membership in order to facilitate enlargement in the formalistic sense, because these countries are already in Europe's sphere of influence. And I think that's the point that I would emphasize, where Bart de Wever is right, is that these countries are under the influence of the European Union, and they want that influence. So we need to find ways to cooperate ever increasingly closely with them and to prevent other actors outside Europe from interfering with their political development. And this is the point I would underscore, right? There are actors outside Europe that are actively using these countries to hurt the European Union. And that is something that the European Union is going to have to push back against. And the only way it can do that is by tightening its relations with the governments of these countries. Call it what you will. They will have to cooperate ever increasingly intensively in order to push back against the destabilization campaigns, the disinformation, in the sabotage and all the rest, right?
So I want to jump back across the pond to DC and have a forward look for a moment here. So, I want to look at what comes next after this Trump administration leaves power. So right now, the transatlantic relationship is broken at the moment. It's in rupture, as you talked about, and many say that it's broken beyond repair. So if and when Dems come back into power, what should be the transatlantic relationship that they want to build going forward? And how do they build that policy out, knowing that in 4 years, it could all be burnt down again and you got to start fresh?
So there's a little deja vu in this conversation, right? Because during the first Trump administration, we faced exactly the same dilemma, right? It's much more intense now, but But if you think about the Biden administration coming into office, was the biggest challenge that the Biden administration faced repairing the transatlantic relationship or putting that relationship on an even keel? No. The biggest challenge the Biden administration faced was earning the trust and rebuilding the bonds between the government of the United States and the American people.
Mm,
I think when this Trump administration leaves, right, whether it's in 3 years or 2,000 years from now, right, that challenge will remain the same. The Democrats, if they ever get back into power, will have to restore faith in government. They will have to convince the people that the federal government works in their interests and not against them. And they will have to address many of the real world concerns that Americans are talking about over the kitchen table or around the water cooler or any other, cliched metaphor you want to throw into the equation. Bottom line is that domestic consolidation is the priority. And the transatlantic relationship will improve if that domestic consolidation takes place. If
yeah.
that domestic consolidation does not take place, then no amount of diplomacy across the Atlantic is going to make a whit of difference, right? Because just as you say, somebody is going to come into power at some point in time in the future that's just going to throw the table over and do exactly what Trump is doing right now, not least because he's shown how effective that kind of political chaos making can be.
Yeah. So I want to close with one last question on, what is the comparative advantage of academia when the pace of global change is just so fast and some would say is outstripping our ability to actually study and keep up with it?
I mean, comparative advantage over policymakers. I mean,
The way I would put it is that there's kind of the think tank, semi-insider, semi-outsider policy folks that are really, they're borderline doing news, but getting quick reaction of what the policy should be. And then there's the academia, which is studying kind of its long-term trends over it. And, where is the offered value within that? And what does it maybe offer that is not able to be done in the more quick reactive policy?
oh, well, I mean, let's be honest. In the current news environment, the signal to noise ratio is terrible, right? And so the more you are required to follow everyday events, the more noise you're going to bring into your analysis, right? It's just inevitable because there's so little signal. I mean, even just trying to discern what is the underlying logic that drives Trump's foreign policy, or whether there is one, whether we're seeing patterns because we're trained to see patterns when there is no pattern, right? I mean, come on, we have to step back to a certain extent. And maybe the thing that's creating the most noise in the room is not the thing that we should be looking at. I was listening to Ezra Klein do an interview with Adam Tooze, and it was so refreshing insofar as whatever the turmoil that's going on in American politics or the transatlantic relationship, Tooze's message was, well, this thing that's happening in China is actually kind of important. It's probably more important than anything else that we're doing right now because it's 1.4 billion people and
Yeah.
they're going through a radical political and economic transformation that's lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, but equally generating a new kind of world power with a completely different political system. And I'm sitting there listening to this going, wow, it must be cool to be an academic and to be able to say, I'm going to shut the noise out for a little bit and focus my attention elsewhere. And then I looked at myself and said, well, wait, I am an academic, right? So I should be able to do that. And in fact, that's what I'm trying to do is to identify these longer run trends, to pick out the signal and ignore as much of the noise as I can. And I have to say, as a human being, because comparative advantage between professional roles, it doesn't deny the fact that we're all human. As a human being, I find the noise so distressing.
Yeah.
It's doing psychological damage to all of us, this noise. And I'm not convinced that's not intentional, right?
Yeah.
I think part of the reason that there's so much noise in our ecosystem, media ecosystem right now, is structural and reflects the incentives of the media. But I think part of it is intentional and reflects the desires of politicians to make us look away, but without, and this is the key point, without allowing us the mental space to focus on extracting the signal that's going to tell us where we should be focusing our attention.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think that's exactly the case. I mean, when we're seeing the administration's war on academia in the U.S., its work with the archives, and then its onslaught of news, it seems like they really are trying to rewrite the narrative, rewrite the history along with it, and ensure we can't keep up to create the actual counterfactual that is the real factual as it's unfolding. But Erik, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Hey, it's been great seeing you. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the conversation. And I hope to talk again soon.
Definitely. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Transatlantic Debrief. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share to your friends and community. As always, if you have comments, questions, or concerns, here's my email, analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. With that, I look forward to seeing you at our next episode.